Good afternoon, everybody.
Good evening, Mike.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm well.
Good, good.
Hi, Mike.
Hey, Pat.
I'll join in on some of the good atmosphere. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm good, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I understand that I'm going to become really good, close friends with our work partners with Tetra Tech. So I'm looking forward to that, Mr. Beekman.
So I got take it off mute. Yep, I look forward to working with you, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's nice to be back in the county again.
Well, from what I heard, it's good to have you. And like I said, look forward to your help.
Literally never try to leave again, Pat. Don't do it.
Okay. I told my boss that I'm staying here until I am done working.
Mm.
Okay, I'm showing now that it is 5:30, and I see we have all of our presenters here as well as some attendees. So I'm going to officially open the public hearing now, and I will read some things into the record. This virtual public hearing is being conducted in accordance with Community Development Block Grant Mitigation Federal Register Notice Volume 84, number 169, and the Richland County CDBG-MIT Action Plan by Richland County government, who is a grantee recovering from a qualifying disaster in 2015 and receiving an allocation of funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, for mitigation activities associated with the qualifying disaster. Due to the current public health pandemic, Richland County is concerned about significant public health risks that may result from holding in-person public meetings, and as such has received guidance from HUD that public hearings in the context of this Federal Register notice include virtual public hearings, alone or in concert with an in-person hearing, if it allows questions in real time with responses coming directly from the grantee's representatives to all the attendees. The purpose of this public hearing is to present and receive public input and comments on Richland County's CDBG-MIT Action Plan. Richland County has established and maintained comprehensive mitigation website at rcgov.us/mitigation, where its CDBG-MIT Action Plan was officially published in English, Spanish, and Korean for public input and comment on March 18, 2020. Public notice of this hearing was provided through local news outlets, Richland County press release, and the Richland County website. Richland County is committed to providing all citizens with equal access to information about the mitigation program, including persons with disabilities and limited English proficiency. So that attendees can participate and ask questions in real time, I'm going to ask one of our staff members, Lauren Hunter, to introduce herself and provide attendees instructions for how to participate.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Hunter, and I want to first say thank you for taking the time to attend today's public hearing. I appreciate your patience and understanding as we all work together to make today's hearing run as smoothly as possible. During our presentation, if you have a question or would like to speak, I will ask you to please virtually raise your hand. If you're joining via web, you can do this by clicking on the hand symbol. If you're joining via telephone, you can do this by pressing *9. Once your hand is raised, I will recognize you by name or telephone number and let you know that you have the floor to speak. I will do my best to recognize everyone throughout the hearing, and we ask you please mute your microphones if you have not been recognized to speak. I'm going to hand it back over to Clayton so we can go ahead and get this started.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I do want to ask those of you who, when you are able to speak, to state your full name and your address for our records. So with that, we'll get into the presentation agenda. If Lauren, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. The agenda for this evening is I'll quickly run through the presenters here and want to welcome everybody who's attending this evening. I'll run through a very brief history of recent disaster and recovery in Richland County to give you a sense of how we got here with CDBG-MIT Funds. And then we'll get into an overview of CDBG-MIT and the Richland County CDBG-MIT Action Plan. And then we will have open time for any public comment and input, but as Lauren stated, obviously throughout the presentation, if you have a question or want to make a comment, feel free to do so. So moving to the next slide and into the next one after that, Lauren. Thank you. South Carolina experienced unprecedented flooding as a result of Hurricane Joaquin in October of 2015, which caused considerable damage throughout Richland County, including the destruction of homes, businesses, infrastructure, public facilities, and the impairment of local and regional businesses and economies. And so in response to that, Congress passed an Appropriations Act to assist with long-term recovery in South Carolina. And as a result of that Appropriations Act, HUD allocated nearly $300 million in community development block grant disaster recovery funds to states and communities to address long-term recovery efforts related to unmet housing, economic development, and infrastructure needs. And as a result of that, Richland County was allocated $23.5 million. Later, Congress passed another Appropriations Act and related to disaster recovery for 2015 and 2016 disasters, and HUD allocated about $400 million in CDBG disaster recovery funds to states and communities. Lauren, if you'll move to the next slide. And so as a result of that allocation, Richland County received an additional funding of $7.2 million. Later, Congress passed another Appropriations Act for CDBG-DR funds, of which $12 billion had to be allocated for mitigation activities. And so in August of 2019, HUD allocated $6.8 billion in community development block grant mitigation funds to grantees recovering from 2015, 2016, and 2017 qualifying disasters. And as a part of that, Richland County has been allocated $21.8 million. And that is the substance of what we'll be discussing today, of how Richland County plans to use those funds. And overall, this chronology shows that the federal government has learned over time that while rebuilding communities through disaster recovery efforts is important, it is perhaps as or more important to fortify or increase the resilience of communities through efforts that will mitigate against future disasters and reduce future losses and lessen the need to rebuild communities. Moving to the next slide, we'll go into an overview of CDBG-MIT. And on the next slide, thank you, Lauren. The CDBG-MIT program represents a unique and significant opportunity for grantees, including Richland County, to use this assistance to carry out strategic and high-impact activities to mitigate disaster risk and reduce future losses. What are these activities and how does HUD define them? Those mitigation activities would be those activities that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. Since this is a supplemental program to the overall CDBG program, CDBG-MIT funds must align with the national objectives of the CDBG program. And those are three listed there. The first one being providing benefits to low and moderate income persons, preventing or eliminating slum and blighted conditions, and addressing urgent community health and welfare needs. CDBG-MIT funds have a statutory focus on benefiting vulnerable lower income people and communities in the most impacted and distressed areas, which essentially means that the primary national objective for these funds is the first one listed there of those three. So thank you, Lauren. Moving into the Richland County CDBG-MIT Action Plan. To receive CDBG-MIT funds, HUD requires that each grantee, including Richland County, must submit an action plan to HUD for approval, detailing the proposed use of all funds allocated, including the criteria for eligibility and how the use of these funds will address mitigation in the most impacted and distressed areas. The action plan consists of four main elements. The first element is a risk-based mitigation needs assessment that identifies and analyzes all significant current and future disaster risks and provides a substantive basis for proposed mitigation activities. The second element essentially identifies what the grantee plans to do with the funds and how much of the funding will be spent on each activity. HUD anticipates that these activities will generally fall within the areas of infrastructure, such as roads, drainage, and utilities improvements designed to reduce the risk of future hazards, economic developments such as business assistance for disaster mitigation improvements and technologies, housing buyout programs, rehabilitation, reconstruction, or homeownership assistance, planning and administration, and public services. That includes modernized and resilient building and land use code updates, regional mitigation planning and education and outreach programs, and also matching funds for other hazard mitigation funds awarded through other entities such as FEMA. The third element is a citizen participation plan, which I will go into more detail on a later slide. And finally, a mitigation pre-award implementation plan, which is designed to provide assurances to HUD that the grantee has the capacity, staffing, communication, financial controls, and policies and procedures to administer the program. And we'll go into a little bit of detail of that in a few slides as well. So this is a timeline of our action plan. We do have to submit it to HUD by August 31st, 2020. That is the deadline for us to submit it. The way we get through that process is our action plan, as I mentioned, was published for public comment on March 18th. We did experience, Richland County did experience some closures to the public, as I mentioned at the beginning, related to the current public health pandemic. And as a result, HUD granted some extensions for the development of the action plan. And as a result, Richland County extended the public comment period by over 30 days to accommodate for that. Our Blue Ribbon Committee is an ad hoc committee that met last week, and that's the advisory committee that oversees input and review of the action plan. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the citizen participation plan in a minute. And then today is our second public hearing. Our Richland County Council ultimately approves the action plan to be submitted to HUD, and that will is planned to occur next month in July prior to submission. So moving to the next slide, thank you, Lauren. The mitigation needs assessment, as I mentioned, is the first element. Richland County partnered with University of South Carolina's Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute, who conducted an empirical geospatial approach model to define the most vulnerable areas within Richland County. This was a similar, almost very similar approach as the state of South Carolina used for its action planning development, as well as the city of Columbia. And in that approach, the county identified 3 areas of analysis: hazard risk, which is hazard risk, basically developing a hazard risk profile compared to social vulnerability of census tracts; potential community lifeline impact index, which again was compared to social vulnerability of census tracts; and household mitigation deficits, which examine the recovery profiles and waiting lists for support for rehabilitation of homes, again compared to social vulnerability of the census tracts. As it relates to the hazard risk profile, given the historic flood event of 2015, the significance of the flood hazard in the county was clear, and it was for this reason that the CDBG-MIT action plan focused on flood hazards and identification of mitigation efforts and activities. The overall hazards assessment for Richland County used data from the 2018 South Carolina Hazard Mitigation Plan update as the foundation. Through a series of maps of individual hazards, a risk profile for Richland County showed the relative level of hazardousness in the region. When compared to the social vulnerability of census tracts, the approach illustrates who is most affected by different hazards and where, which for riverine flooding was Broad River Road, north of I-20, Clemson Road, Two Notch Road area, our Decker Boulevard, Decker Center area, and Lower Richland, including Gadsden, Eastover, and Hopkins. And this also aligned well with the total hazard risk approach that was used. The potential lifeline impacts based on the potential community lifeline impact index showed an overall concentration of potential lifeline impacts in the less populated census tracts in Richland County. Additionally, the higher levels of potential lifeline impact appear in census tracts with higher levels of social vulnerability, which was highest in the areas of Lower Richland and the Decker Center, Decker Boulevard areas. Household mitigation deficits with flooding risk, areas with the highest social vulnerability were coupled with household mitigation deficits and flooding risk, and those areas were identified as extending west from I-77 near Woodfield and continuing to Decker Boulevard, Arcadia Lakes, the Shakespeare Road, Two Notch area, and northern parts of Forest Acres. And so moving to the next slide, I am going to introduce our first presenter, Mike King. He is our Assistant Director for Emergency Services and the county's Flood Recovery Manager, and he'll be talking about one of our planned programs in terms of meeting those mitigation activities.
Thank you, Clayton. Good evening, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and obviously an honor to be able to present this information. One of the things I'd like to talk about is improving our water supply infrastructure, our fire suppression water supply infrastructure in the Lower Richland area. As Clayton had mentioned earlier, the October 2015 flooding event impacted hundreds of residents and our infrastructure throughout Richland County. And during the incident, the county experienced severe storms and heavy rainfall, which resulted in failure of several privately owned dams. The southwest quadrant of the county, which is mostly rural, was significantly impacted by the storm and the subsequent damages. Now, several of these dams support private ponds, and these ponds serve as a crucial water supply source for our rural firefighting, fire suppression activities, as these are in areas where there are no pressurized water hydrant systems. Now, 3 of these critical water points, natural water points, we commonly refer to them as dry hydrants. And that's somewhat of a confusing term. What a dry hydrant is we utilize the water in these ponds through a piping and snorkel system to be able to fill our tanker trucks or water tanker trucks via the pumps installed on the tank. So they're called dry hydrants, but basically it's a snorkel system in the ponds. And 3 of these key ponds were decimated due to the dam failure. And the loss of these natural water points has negatively affected the fire department's ability to effectively resupply their fire suppression water supply during emergency operations. Unfortunately, the owners of these dams have been unable to repair the damage and restore the natural water supply for our suppression needs. Through this project that we're proposing, we hope to be able to use CDBG-MIT Mitigation Funds to build a resilient fire suppression water system to mitigate future impacts from flooding or other type of natural disasters in the area. And we're hoping, we're focusing on replacing 3 of the decimated water points. And if possible, if funding allows, we'd like to add 3 additional water resupply points in the area. And the focus is obviously improved service delivery, but also working on improving the Insurance Services Office public protection classification for our area residents. So again, we would like to install up to 6 strategically located private wells on county property. And these will have high capacity pumps. They'll have an independent power generation system and a storage tank as needed to supply a continuous pressurized source of water for our fire suppression needs. One of the things we'd also like to point out that we'll also be very, very focused on compliance with DHEC well standards and DHEC well permitting requisites on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Our next presenter is Cynthia Williams, who is our Stormwater General Manager in our Department of Public Works for Richland County.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Cynthia Williams. I'm the Stormwater Manager for Richland County. And so one of the things with some other infrastructure projects was the Department of Public Works put together a team to kind of look at our most critical infrastructure and come up with some additional infrastructure projects. And so we had people from engineering, stormwater, the roads and drainage maintenance, folks who deal with the drainage system pretty much on a daily basis in one form or another. We tried to tie the process down of looking at additional infrastructure projects to the requirements of the CDBG-DR mitigation program, projects that would protect life and safety, protect transportation networks, and then we also did the overlap of looking at low and moderate income areas as well. So we looked at areas of high risk. One of the things that we were very fortunate that we completed right before the October 2015 flood was the completion of a 25-year strategic plan that looked at the county's drainage network and some of the needs that we would have. As part of that, there was a criticality analysis that was done of the county's infrastructure. The criticality analysis was a desktop analysis that looked at the age of the infrastructure, the material of the infrastructure, and the remaining useful life. And then, so if it's old material that's more likely to fail, what's the likelihood of it failing? And then what are the consequences of that material, of that pipe failing? By looking at its connection to major roadways, hospitals, neighborhoods, things like that. So based off of the criticality analysis, infrastructure was given a score, and then it was rated as either high, very high, or medium or low risk. And so the map, which I know is difficult to read, but it's just kind of a quick snapshot. The colors are of the very high, high, and medium risk infrastructure based off of that criticality analysis. Also, after the October 2015 flood, there was a study that was done on some culverts, crossings that were undersized, and pipes that needed to be looked at to probably upsize. And so a lot of those areas were also in these high risk infrastructure that have been identified in that criticality analysis. So the plan is we put all those projects in. Another thing with that 25-year plan was the creation of a project ranking database. It is what the Department of Public Works currently uses to rank capital projects. It ranks projects based on how it handles flood control, stormwater management, the number of people that are benefited by the project. And it gives a project kind of an unbiased score so that we can easily look at our infrastructure needs, our capital projects needs, and try to make sound decisions as we select and move forward capital projects. So the additional projects that we looked at, we put into that same database to rank them. And then the higher scoring projects, those were the ones that were overlaid with some of the LMI areas as well, so that we could try to address some of the CDBG-DR additional needs and the ones that we knew would help not only the most vulnerable communities, but would also help some of our most critical needed infrastructure. So the infrastructure we're focusing on is hard infrastructure, pipes, culverts, catch basins, to try to bring those up to standard, improve that, get rid of some of the old aging infrastructure that we have, upsize the culverts that are undersized, and also do a watershed study. A lot of the watersheds in Richland County, several of them have been studied before, and some where we know we have additional flooding problems that had never received a study before. We're looking at trying to pinpoint some more areas of what may be going on to cause some of the flooding in those areas. And so the department was given a program budget of about $7 million, and we're trying to make sure we make the best impact to improving our network based off of that amount of funding that we have. And next slide.
Thank you, Sunithia. As I mentioned earlier, the focus of Richland County CDBG-MIT mitigation programs is to reduce future impacts caused by climate-sensitive hazards, specifically relating to flooding and severe storms, as well as to enhance the long-term resilience of community lifelines and address the unmet household mitigation needs among the most socially vulnerable populations. One of the things that was found in our mitigation needs assessment was that only about 35% of Richland County homeowners have received financial assistance to help repair and or mitigate future damage to their homes from federal, state, and county programs. Thus, the overall unmet housing mitigation deficit in Richland County remains at 65%. And so to address this deficit, we're planning to provide assistance through two housing programs. One is our housing rehabilitation reconstruction program and our voluntary buyout program. And I'll speak about the housing program first, and then Mike King will address the buyout program. So Richland County established two objectives for its single-family housing rehabilitation program. The first objective is to provide resilient housing in the Richland County most impacted and distressed areas, or the HUD most impacted and distressed areas, through the use of mitigation measures, including but not limited to elevation, dry flood proofing, home hardening, and disaster, flood, and mold resistant construction materials that are designed to mitigate against the impact of future disasters. And of course, the second objective is to prioritize the housing needs of low and moderate income households, which will be done through an application and eligibility process.
Good evening. This is Mike King again. We're really pleased to have the opportunity to continue our voluntary buyout program that was initiated after the 2015 flood event with FEMA. HMGP was this hazard mitigation grant program, their buyout program. And at this time, we've been able to acquire 56 properties, and they are in the process being demolished, and also the land returned to naturalized state. What we're requesting is to continue the voluntary buyout program. And what we're hoping to do is use portion of the funds to acquire, demolish, and return to a naturalized state 11 residential properties and 3 non-residential properties. And we're working very closely with the Richland County floodplain manager to identify the properties which are located in the spatial flood hazard area and have a history of repetitive loss, again, with a focus on mitigation and future resilience.
Thank you, Mike. So as part of this grant per the Federal Register, as I mentioned earlier, 15% of the total, no more than 15% of the total grant award can go to planning purposes. And for Richland County, this would include development of and amendments to our action plan and development of a property acquisition and land management policy for the county. And as far as program administration is concerned, the Federal Register realizes a 5% max for program administration, and those funds will support the administration of the programs, which would include education and outreach for those programs, and as well as to support the pre-award implementation plan that I mentioned earlier. The third element that I mentioned earlier was the citizen participation plan. It's designed to encourage participation by the public and allow equal access to information about the CDBG-MIT program by all citizens. As part of that, public hearings are required to collect input from citizens and stakeholders in writing or orally. And we held our first one prior to the issuance of the action plan on March 12th. And today is our second public hearing, and both of those are required by HUD through the Federal Register. The public notice and comment period, it was announced on the Richland County mitigation website that I mentioned earlier. The required public notice and comment period for an initial action plan is 45 days. But as I mentioned, we extended that by over 30 days to accommodate our closure to the public. And any subsequent amendments to the action plan require a 30-day public comment period accompanied by another public hearing. We also have the Blue Ribbon Ad Hoc Advisory Committee, which was charged with viewing and providing input on the action plan. At the last meeting of our advisory committee, it was unanimously approved to move the CDBG-MIT action plan to council, incorporating any public comments that we would receive for this action plan. Again, through the mitigation website, it is an ongoing website that we have where we will be reporting on a quarterly basis our performance as it relates to all the programs. And it will also be, as I mentioned earlier too, the action plan has been published in Korean and Spanish as well. The implementation plan provides assurances to HUD that the grantee has the capacity to carry out mitigation activities, and those are defined through several areas. Financial controls are a mechanism to ensure that Richland County has the appropriate financial management policies, procedures, and systems in place to be able to account for funds provided by HUD. Our Office of Procurement and Contracting is currently following our Richland County ordinances and its own procurement standards, where these standards are equally or more restrictive as federal procurement requirements. However, where the local procurement starts or requirements are less restrictive, the more stringent federal requirements will be followed for the CDBG-MIT program. Related to duplication of benefits, federal law prohibits any person, business concern, or other entity receiving federal funds for any part of such loss as to which he or she has already received financial assistance under another program, private insurance, charitable assistance, or any other sorts. And this duplicative funding is called duplication of benefits. So we have to ensure that through our policies and procedures that duplication of funding is not occurring. As it relates to timeliness of expenditures for these grant funds, that's defined as 6 years from the time of HUD's execution of our grant agreement. For the first 50% of funds, and all funds expended must be expended within 12 years of the grant agreement. Within the 12-year grant timeline, there are also requirements for prompt payment as part of the general financial management process. And Richland County must have policies and procedures to address that, and those are included in our action plan. In terms of management of funds, Richland County also has to ensure that the appropriate protocols are in place to manage the CDBG-MIT funds and to incorporate measures to prevent fraud, waste, and or abuse of government funds. As part of this, we are enhancing our internal audit program by hiring an additional internal auditor for this program. In terms of, I mentioned the comprehensive mitigation website that as required by HUD, that must be a public-facing website with program information pertaining to applicants and stakeholders posted on an ongoing basis. In terms of capacity assessment and staffing, the county was required to assess its capacity and staffing to ensure that, again, those mitigation activities could be carried out. And we will be seeking the assistance of an implementing contractor to assist and support our current staffing for implementation of this action plan. And finally, internal and interagency coordination is required. We have been in contact and shared plans with City of Columbia and Lexington County, as they have shared theirs with us as well, and as well as internally among our departments. So at this time, this is a period for any public input or comment. At any time, as Lauren mentioned, attendees or anyone has the ability to raise their hand and ask any questions or make any public comments that they wish. Again, I just ask that you state your full name and address for our records so that we can keep track of that. As I mentioned earlier, any public comment that's included, we are required by HUD to provide a summary of those comments and respond to those comments and incorporate those into our action plan when we submit it to HUD. So at this time, we'll open it up to any public comments or inputs.
Carol Kozowski, you're recognized. I see your hand, Carol, but I can't hear you. Try to unmute if you can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, let me start once again. I'm Carol Kozowski. I chair the Richland County Conservation Commission. I am also a founding member of the Blue Ribbon Committee on Flood Recovery, and I am a long-term taxpayer and member, and I live right here at 5225 Lakeshore Drive right here in Richland County. I chair the Richland County Conservation Commission, and I have a couple of comments to make on behalf of the Conservation Commission. One comment and one question. The comment I have to make is that we have submitted in writing to you some additional comments on this plan for the record, and we would ask for your consideration in responding to that written document. This document that was submitted to you this morning by email was voted on and was unanimously approved with one abstention by the Richland County Conservation Commission. And so I wanted to be sure that that document got into the record. Now, as far as the question, I have one overarching question, and that concerns the budget. We have requested some information on the budget. In particular, how are the categories derived and the amounts determined? For example, when you look at the budget, there's about 7 million on stormwater drainage and infrastructure, 6.1 million on single family housing, about 3 million on voluntary buyouts, 3.7 on CDBG-MIT planning, and about 1 million under program administration, coming to the $21.8 million. How are those categories determined? How was it determined? How much money went into each one of those categories? So why is that important? Well, without such information, the Richland County Conservation Commission and the Blue Ribbon Committee on Flood Recovery and the public are unable to determine the appropriateness or the benefit of the proposed budget. This is an overarching issue, and so I would ask the designers of this grant application to please explain the issue of the overall budget and how the dollar amounts were assigned by category. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for that question. As it relates to different programs, I'm going to ask some of our presenters maybe to respond to that. And I'll talk generally. I believe the budget for the housing programs, the voluntary budget, the voluntary buyout program, the budget for that, they use the pre-disaster appraisal price for each property that was identified with an estimated average cost for closings, appraisal fees, demolitions, incentives, uniform relocation assistance costs, and contingency costs. As for the single family housing program, the initial budget was based on the estimated average construction and relocation costs under a program currently operating under the disaster recovery program that would meet the portion of the household mitigation deficit identified in the mitigation needs assessment. And that was represented by 111 homes. But due to competing funding priorities identified by the infrastructure programs, in the voluntary buyout program, the budget was reduced to rehabilitate an estimated 80 homes. And I would ask our other presenters maybe to talk about the infrastructure projects and how those budgets were arrived at.
This is Sunithia Williams. I wasn't sure if Mike was going to speak up on his first, but with the infrastructure projects that we were looking at, we based off the estimate, based off other capital projects for engineering and also construction to implement the projects. So after the projects were ranked and narrowed down, we had originally a very long list. I mean, we could have spent the entire $21 million just on the county's infrastructure, but once we narrowed it down based off of the high risk, the scoring in the project database, and some of the other things such as the LMI areas and those kind of critical needs, the top projects that came out of that, this is what the average estimated cost for engineering and construction came out to be.
Thank you, Sunithia. On our project, especially, one of the things we were really very conscious on cost savings, and that's why we're focusing on utilizing existing county-owned properties. So there's not going to be an issue of having to purchase property, put our wells on there. And we did a study with industry experts as far as the equipment, the cost, the average cost of drilling wells, et cetera. And that's how we came up with our estimate. But you also see our estimate is somewhat flexible, because if we can cut costs in every area that we can cut costs, we can actually add additional wells. We know we need at least 3, but we would really hope to be able to add up to 6 with those funds.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. And as I mentioned earlier as well, the 20% of the grant is going to planning and administration per the cap as identified in the Federal Register. So those numbers were derived directly from the grant amount.
All right, we're going to move on to our next question. Trish German, you are now recognized and have the floor.
Thank you very much. Am I properly unmuted here?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much. My name is Trish German. I live at 1513 Pinemont Drive in the city limits, although I am representing the Gills Creek Watershed Association tonight. And the Gills Creek Watershed, as you know, extends from up beyond Sesqui down to the Congaree River. Couple things. I want to commend you for getting this out in Spanish and Korean as well. And I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. So kudos to whoever put that through the process. I want to emphasize how important we think public involvement is. And we had a little bit of trouble getting notice in a timely manner about opportunities to participate and review. And I'm sure it's not a surprise to you guys that 5:30 on a Friday afternoon is maybe not the most popular time for a public hearing. But you know all that, and we would just like to encourage you in the future to help us figure out how to get materials well in advance and find out about public hearings well in advance. But what I want to say on the positive side is I was really, really excited to hear a mention of the planning effort to develop, if I understood it correctly, to develop a policy on buyouts and land management. We have talked about that so much within the Gills Creek Watershed Association that it's very important to prevent problems before they happen. So many cities around the country, cities and I suppose counties around the country have developed buyout policies moving back away from the floodplains. And I think it's really, really exciting that that's a part of your plan. And Gills Creek would like to be helpful in that regard if it's appropriate. Cheer you on or give you advice or weigh in with criteria, that sort of thing. I think that's very important. And a little bit to echo Carol's question about how the amounts were determined, how you determine what weight to give to various categories. When I heard 3 million for buyouts right now, that sounds like a whole lot, but it's not going to buy out a lot of properties. And so if there are any opportunities to get additional funds, we would encourage you to do that so that you can get more properties out of the way of floodwaters. Thanks very much.
Thank you for those comments.
All right, Ann Yancey, you now have the floor. You are recognized to speak.
Hi, thank you. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate everything you're doing, appreciate this opportunity. I live at 820 Cross Hill Road in the city of Columbia, and I'm here with the Gills Creek Watershed Association. To tag onto what Trish just said, I understand this looks like a whole lot of money until you start trying to divide it up, and it goes pretty quickly. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you are prioritizing in the sense that if something is feasible and ready to go, is that going to get a higher priority than something that maybe is not so much, or is there another way of determining?
All right, thank you for the question. If I'm understanding you correctly, are you asking about how we are prioritizing projects within the various programs, or?
Correct.
Okay, so I can speak for the housing program. The buyout programs were prioritized based, or the projects there were prioritized based on those homes that were inside the floodway, the special flood hazard area, and they were also identified and prioritized based on the amount of repetitive loss that those properties have accumulated. And then for the housing rehabilitation program, we are prioritizing applications based on low and moderate income individuals. So as those individuals apply, they would have to meet HUD standards in terms of low to moderate income individuals that would qualify, as well as disaster damaged homes that would qualify for mitigation funding, and to be inclusive of mitigation measures. So that's how we would prioritize within those programs. And Sunithia and Mike, perhaps you can speak to the infrastructure programs.
Again, our prioritization was fairly easy because we had our 3 key water points that we knew were decimated by this storm, and we want to relocate the sustained and resilient water supply, the wells and the pumps in those areas.
Hi, this is Sunithia. Yeah, one of the benefits with the infrastructure projects is that they're all our county infrastructure. So it makes it, all of them are pretty good to go. We don't have to deal as much with, trying to deal with, private property owners as our pipes. And so that makes them pretty much shovel ready. It's mostly just getting the studies done to figure out what type of upsize or what kind of change of material will be needed to make sure the pipes can handle the flows that are coming to them. So that benefits us. And then again, with our project ranking database, it also helps us look at which projects will have the biggest impact compared to other projects.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles W., you now have the floor to speak. If you're talking, Charles, you might be on mute. You want to check if you can turn your mute off so we can hear you.
Okay, I'm Charles Weber. I live at 133 Deer Track Drive, and I'm also a commissioner on the Richland County Conservation Commission. I think this question is for Sanithia, but I may be in error. Of the 7.1 million that's in that account, and if I understand what you just said is correct, that these projects that are on this list, individual projects, are basically shovel ready. It looks like to me that 2/3 of that 7 million is going to be used on study and design. And only 2.5 million is actually going to create a situation that we get an improvement. I certainly would like some additional explanation on that, please, ma'am.
Oh, no, it's design and construction. One of the reasons why in the actual plan, we list the way we're going to rank projects, but we already have specific road names, specific culvert crossings. So it is design and construction. And the benefit is that if for a reason one of the projects comes in under budget, we can go back to additional project lists and hopefully do some other projects. So no, it's not just for studies. It's not just for the design. We also want to do construction. One of the things is also to do the camera CCTV inspections of the high-risk infrastructure. By doing that, we know we will probably identify some immediate needs, fixes that need to happen right then. And so that way we can quickly respond to those with construction and upsizing of the pipes.
Charles, is that all you have before I recognize anyone else?
What I'm drawing your attention to, and I'm an engineer as well. When you got 2/3 of your total expenses is in design, and only 1/3 of that is materials to get it ready, that doesn't sound right to me in my experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Reese, you now have the floor.
Yes, my name is Robert Reese, as you just mentioned, and I live at 204 Sonoma Drive. And I serve as the president of the Lower Richland branch of the NAACP. And I'm sorry if this was stated earlier, but this is for Sanithia and for the projects that is dedicated or designated for the well development. Where can I get a list of those projects that are allocated, and are they allocated by district, so we'll know just which part of the counties are going to be the beneficiaries of these projects?
I can speak on that. As far as the fire suppression well projects, those are all, the three are going to be all in the Lower Richland area. And then again, if we have any funding remaining, we will look at other areas where we can improve the water supply, the fire suppression water supply. But all three of those projects will be in the Lower Richland area. We have a list of county properties we're looking at right now. We want to make sure we select the best property to do the well installation on, and then we'll be moving forward from that.
Can you, and I don't know if Sanithia if she has a list of the projects that are broken down my district, and if not, if there's a place where we can access those, I gladly access those online. And even for the well projects that you just mentioned, I don't know if there's specific areas of the Lower Richland community, but I would love to be able to make the community aware that these activities and these projects are slated for work in our community.
Yes, there is a list of the specific culverts in the places where we're going to have some of the additional infrastructure projects, and those can be sent to you.
And as far as the water project, the actual specific sites have not been identified yet. Again, we're still in the evaluation process, but all three of the replacement sites will be in the lower Richland area. And once we have those locations, we'd be happy to provide those and with the accompanying district.
Thank you.
And just to follow up, we, as I mentioned, we will be providing regular updates through our mitigation website on all of the details of the projects as they progress and move forward.
Trish German, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you. I don't want to keep anybody else from speaking, and I certainly don't want to stand between everybody and dinner, but with a different hat on than when I was speaking before, it occurred to me when you were talking about the housing rehabilitation, I wonder if you have explored any resources to increase energy efficiency as you are rehabbing those houses, because it's a lovely opportunity to reduce long-term operation costs in those buildings. And there might be some local resources that would that could be brought to bear on that. And I can get with you outside the confines of this if that would be helpful, if that's something that you're able to think about.
Yeah, yes, I appreciate that. That would be very helpful. As part of our requirements through the Federal Register, green construction standards, including energy efficiency, are part of the things we have to take into consideration. So I would love to get with you offline and talk about those local resources.
Okay, we'll do that.
And my information is, as well as Lauren's information, is on the mitigation website if anyone wants to reach out to us. But I'd be glad to get your information and follow up with you directly.
Okay, that is all I have for notifications. So again, if anyone else would like to speak, now is your time to raise your hands, have any questions, statements. Our public comment will close at the conclusion of this meeting. So we appreciate everyone taking their time today and coming forward. We appreciate all of the feedback and we'll be making notes of all of the comments here today and including that in our action plan when we submit it to HUD. So I'll turn it back over to Clayton for closing thoughts if we have no other questions or comments.
No, I don't have anything else, and just echo the appreciation for everyone participating today and asking the questions and hearing what our plan is for CDBG-MIT Funds. We did schedule an hour for us to go through the presentation and get public input and comments. We're not quite closed yet, and I think I see one other person has their hand up.
Yes, Robert Reese. You have the floor to speak.
Yes, I just want to know, one, will there be another public hearing that would provide a little bit more notice for the public so that more people have an opportunity to hear what's going on? I wait to hear the response to that.
We're not going to be holding a specific public hearing for the purposes of the initial action plan. However, public input is always welcome through the mitigation website. There's things through our citizen participation plan where ongoing input can be provided. In addition to that, as we launch certain programs, our planning funds will be designated to plan for outreach and awareness of the programs. So that's an ongoing thing.
And one last question. Are you working collaboratively with the water extension projects that utility department has ongoing?
If there's some sort of connection with the infrastructure programs, I would have to defer to Sanithia or Mike.
This is Sanithia. No, the utilities department, that's a separate department than the Department of Public Works. They deal with water and sewer, and we're storm drainage and roads. So no, those projects don't really interact.
One of the things we're going to do as the pressurized water system is expanded in our county, we're going to be working as part of our planning process with the utilities department to make sure that we maximize the location of our wells. That way, we're making sure we improve or provide the most efficient service.
Okay, well, with that, thank you again, everyone, for participating in this evening's public hearing. As Lauren said, we'll be taking the comments back and compiling them and including them as part of our submission for our CDBG-MIT action plan. Yep. Mr. Reese.
Yeah, listen, can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And listen, I apologize, but since this is going to be the only time that the public has to ask these questions, I've just got one more question. And this is because I'm in the Lower Richland area, and we've got these new fire hydrants and this new water project going on. And I just want to know if somebody can answer, why is the fire suppression not connected? Why is fire suppression not connected?
Well, as the water system is expanded and hydrants are installed, they will automatically, after they're certified, they will be connected and they will improve the water supply in that area. And again, that's why it's important that we work with the utilities department to make sure when we install the wells, obviously the water supply system is not going to be pressurized water supply systems, not going to be available everywhere in Lower Richland at this time. And that's why these other auxiliary water sources are so important to provide water for our firefighting efforts down there. And our whole intent is to improve water suppression, or water supply for fire suppression through the pressurized system as it grows out, but also through these well systems, which are a much more resilient and capable water supply than pumping out of a pond.
So does that mean that the suppression will supplant other areas without hydrants? Is that what you're saying?
That is these areas where we're using the dry hydrants that I explained earlier. These are areas without pressurized water systems. That's why they're so important.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it. And you all forgive me for being so very specific about the areas down here, but we really want to make sure that this area is going to be at least beneficiary of some of these projects. Thank you.
Absolutely, Mr. Reese. Thank you for your input. We appreciate you being here and having all of your comments to say. So thank you for taking advantage of the public hearing. Absolutely.
Clayton, as a final thought before we close, will you please talk about the process in terms of substantial amendments to the plan? I know that this may be the last public hearing we have scheduled, but I don't know that we've ever had an action plan that did not have such amendments and thereby provide additional opportunities for input.
That's correct. Our CDBG disaster recovery action plan has had at least 5 substantial amendments where we have held additional public hearings. And the thought from HUD there is that they almost anticipate jurisdictions having these substantial amendments because we don't know everything up front. We don't know what kinds of things we're going to experience once we receive applications, once we appraise properties and get into the details of the program. And so with each one of those, we've had a public hearing, and quite frankly, I think we anticipate having additional public hearings whenever those amendments come out. And as was done with this one, we'll announce it on the website. We will announce it in local news outlets and through our Richland County website overall, and news releases as much as possible. Okay, and with that, it is a little bit past 6:30, and at this time, I again want to appreciate all the comments. And got
Charles is raised his hand.
I've got him. Charles, you have the floor to speak. You might need to unmute, Ms. Charles. We're not able to hear you.
Okay, I think I'm on now. Charles Weber again from Little Mountain. I'm looking at the infrastructure. And I realize we got limited funds in that project, but I'm looking at $4 million that's going to be put into a study. And I'm sure it's needed. But then I take a look at the rest of the projects there, and it's very little in study on the rest of the projects, and the predominant expenditures is in construction. Makes common sense to me. But I think it's irresponsible for us to spend $4 million studying something that's going to occur in the future. It may be that's needed, but then we and I need to go to council and ask council to find that money, and let's spend the money that we're getting on getting results, getting projects in place that we can accomplish from this. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I give another minute in case somebody else has their hand up or wants to ask a question.
Clayton, I apologize for interrupting again. I'll just say that I think we heard from Carol during the Blue Ribbon Committee about some concerns about the infrastructure portion of the project, and I'm hearing those sentiments echoed here. So I would ask that, Sunithia, you reach out to the commission and set up a meeting to discuss these concerns prior to moving this to council.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, if there are no other comments or questions, again, thank you all. I hope you have a good evening and a good weekend. And again, thank you for your participation, and I look forward to working with some of you offline after this. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Director Warner.